Good evening. I'm Joe Nye, Dean of the Kennedy School, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's panel discussion on the 75th anniversary of America's most widely read and influential magazine on U.S. foreign policy and international affairs, namely Foreign Affairs. Foreign Affairs began in 1922 as a publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, and as McGeorge Bundy said, indeed a former editor of the journal, both the Council and the magazine have stressed from the first that divergent opinions were inevitable and to be welcomed. And that's been the history of this journal. Among the famous articles that have been published over the years are George Kennan's famous X article proposing a policy of Soviet containment, Richard Nixon's brief for friendly relations with China, as well as articles by 11 former secretaries of state and such influential figures as W.E.B. Du Bois, Franklin Roosevelt, Walter Lippmann, and others. If we look at the current situation, what we find is that Foreign Affairs has celebrated its birthday with the publication of a book which has collected some of the most notable articles over its history. The book is entitled The American Encounter, the United States and the Making of the Modern World. These essays have been compiled by the editor of Foreign Affairs, Jim Hogue, and he is going to lead us tonight in our panel. Jim, prior to joining Foreign Affairs, served 3 decades as a newspaper journalist, 2 of them as editor and publisher of dailies in Chicago and New York. He's a graduate of Harvard Business School and was a fellow here at the Kennedy School in 1992. And under his leadership, Foreign Affairs has continued to grow, not only in circulation, but I would argue in liveliness as well. Graham Allison, who will follow him, since we're going in alphabetical order, was Dean of the Kennedy School from 1977 to 89, as the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government, and the director of the recently rededicated Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, a former Secretary of Defense, Assistant Secretary of Defense, and also at one time a director of the Council on Foreign Relations. Samuel Huntington is the Albert Weatherhead University Professor at Harvard and director of the John M. Olin Institute of Strategic Studies at the Harvard Center for International Affairs, former president of the American Political Science Association. Jessica Matthews graduated from Radcliffe in 1967, received her PhD in molecular biology from Caltech in 1973, and is now the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, has served on both the National Security Council and in the State Department. And Richard Pipes is, of course, our own Frank Baird Professor of History, now emeritus, and has served on the Harvard faculty since 1950. A former director of the Russian Research Center, he also served under President Reagan in the National Security Council. So we have before you a distinguished panel, people with different types of expertise, all of whom have contributed to a very famous journal, Foreign Affairs. And I would like to turn first to that editor of the distinguished journal, Jim Hogue. Jim?
Thank you, Joe. Are these working? People can hear? As you can see from the sweep, Foreign Affairs owes a lot to the Harvard community. The people around me this evening up here, as well as many others from Harvard, and dare I say MIT occasionally, have contributed a number of articles over the years. Since there are so many of us, we're going to try and be real short in our introductory comments so that we can have a real discussion with you. As Joe mentioned, for our 75th anniversary, we have put out a book called The American Encounter, which is, in a sense, an intellectual history of America's engagement in the world in the 20th century. And in sifting through the thousands of essays that we've had over that period of time, several things came to mind, but one that I want to stress tonight, and that is that some of the very large issues that we are looking at today were present then when this magazine began, albeit under different circumstances and perhaps for different reasons. And in my brief opening comments, I want to focus on 2 of them. 75 years ago, the existing international order was confronted with the challenge of how do you incorporate rising great powers. Then it was Japan and Germany, and for a variety of reasons I won't go into right now, the aspirants, as well as the powers of the day, were unable to forge successful incorporation, and as you know, major conflicts resulted. Now, today the challenge of incorporation is, if anything, more challenging than it was then. Again, there are clearly rising powers, and this time they are all non-Western. The most obvious aspirant is China, to be followed sometime soon in the next century by other non-Western powers. A couple of key questions. Can the rising states of the current era be channeled into an international order that's based on rules, negotiations, agreed upon modes of conduct? And equally important, can the international order itself adjust, as it perhaps has not in the past, to sufficiently reflect the interests and the cultures of the new big players? The answers to these questions are getting their first big test, I believe, in how the relationship between China and the United States is evolving. Between the two countries, there are enough significant differences and potential flashpoints of conflict to align them as adversaries. Taiwan, Tibet, Korea, the WTO, these could all be viewed, for the sake of these introductory comments, as labels for a number of sensitive issues that could bedevil the relationship. But there are also positive historical legacies, if you go back far enough, in China-American relations. And there are current convergence of interests that could result in interactions that are more cooperative than confrontational. A strategic dialogue, and that is something less than a strategic partnership, a dialogue that recognizes the power, the interests, and the influence of each is possible. Indeed, it is necessary if a policy of constructive engagement, which we are currently seeking, is to prove fruitful. At this time, both parties are showing some mutual recognition of the need to engage, to manage those things that we can agree upon, as well as those things on which we will differ. But the real work, I would submit, lies ahead on big issues such as security arrangements in the Pacific, the management of energy, environmental, and proliferation concerns, and the terms of entry for China into the WTO, which will help define what the rules of international trade are going to be in the future. Now, with careful direction and a few breaks, China and the United States ought to be able to sustain a working relationship for the next 5 to 10 years. China wants to focus on its domestic development, so it desires a stable international environment, free of major crises and threats, and as a status quo power, we would like the same. Further into the next century, China will be stronger, and when it is, I think the challenges of our relationship are going to be greater. Thus, it is the immediate period ahead that is a time for the United States to vigorously pursue regional forms of cooperation in the Pacific that are also going to be key, I submit, to a wider international cooperative order. Trade liberalization is the other issue that was prominent in the early days of foreign affairs that I'd like to touch on this evening. It is now front and center again. Then the world slipped into protectionism with disastrous results. Now we see liberalism is again under attack, and in the quarter from which it most needs leadership, the United States. This is so despite the visible benefits the U.S. has gained from trade liberalization over the last 50 years and the superior competitive condition of our country's economy with which to achieve additional benefits from further liberalization. Yet the President finds himself denied by the Congress the fast-tracked capability to negotiate further multilateral trade accords. Resurgent economic nationalism is certainly not unique to the United States, of course, but its timing here is ironic. The biggest adjustments to globalization may indeed be behind us. For example, blue-collar workers, who have admittedly taken the biggest hits in this process, now represent 16% of the economy, and that's a fairly steady figure. We seem to be down to what we're going to keep in the region, in that area of manufacturing and industry. And as a result, there is a tight, semi-skilled labor market, and this suggests in turn that some of the purchasing power lost over the last 25 years may now be gained back in the years to come. Well, that's just as an example. It would be best, in my opinion, if a renewed effort to get fast-tracked authority was successful in the Congress, but it may not be. And even without it, the United States needs to pursue further liberalization unilaterally and bilaterally. As economist Jagdish Bhagwati has pointed out, such ultra-modern industries as telecommunications and financial services gain their momentum largely from unilateral openness and deregulation. Structural adjustments, the need of which is so apparent now in East Asia and Latin America, will be harder to come by without further trade and investment liberalization. Now, when global economics turn sour, the first challenge I mentioned, which is the incorporation of rising powers and the adjustment of an international system itself to the presence of new powers, becomes all the tougher to pull off. So in conclusion, let me say that I think the world ahead will have greater economic and political problems than than those now racking the countries of East Asia if liberalization is stalled or is reversed. And I think it is devoutly to be hoped that we do not head into that world on the same path that served us so poorly once before earlier in this century. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Jim. Graham?
Thank you very much, Joe. The topic, as I understand it, is the world ahead, or that as one thinks about the past 75 years of this remarkable journal, Foreign Affairs, the challenge is nonetheless to try to peer towards the future and imagine what might be happening in the decade or maybe even further ahead. Now, one of my former Harvard College classmates, Peter Goldmark, and I like making up highfalutin quotations, which we then attribute to somebody who's also fictitious, and then offer. And one of Peter's good lines is that the great thing about the future is that most of it is ahead of us. On one occasion, we came to an event, and he had put this up on the wall as a big quotation, and he attributed it to A.J. Parkinson, who's, again, a fictitious brother of the famous Parkinson. In any case, if I were going to give you a version of an almost made-up, profound proposition, I would say the most important truth about the future is that it is uncertain. Now, genuinely uncertain and unknown because it is unknowable. Thus, as we listen to comments, including some that I'm going to offer, or proffer prophecies about the decade or maybe even the 75 years ahead, listeners should beware or be cautious and recognize that what we're talking about is one possible projection of the future. Indeed, I would offer you as antidote sort of two crutches. First, when you hear projections about the decade or two ahead, about 2010 or 2020, or as we come to the millennium, there'll certainly be 100-year and further projections. Take those as one alternative possible future and ask yourself, what are two or three other plausible alternatives, contending scenarios? And secondly, to sharpen your sense of this truth about the future, namely uncertainty, and widen your priors, as you would learn in your decision theory course, recall the decade past and ask how many times has something that was unlikely happened? How about things that were inconceivable? How about things that were declared to be impossible? I remember very well at the Defense Department a fellow who was Yeltsin's security advisor, Rurikov coming to visit me. And he said, looking back on the past 5 years when he was in Washington for his son to marry, for his daughter to marry an American, okay? He said that if you had told him 5 years ago that either one of two scenarios happened. One, Martians came, took over the earth, caused everything to happen the way that it's happened. Or secondly, that things happened the way they did. The first would be much more plausible than the second. He said even thinking about it would be more plausible. So lots of unpredictable, even inconceivable things happen. And I think that reminds us that I think Havel's good line, that things in the recent past have changed so fast that we've hardly had time yet to be astonished. And we're living in a period of very rapid change. Okay, all that being said, looking forward, I would offer you two scenarios just as placeholders, and let me try to make them plausible briefly, one of which is more positive and one of which is more negative. The more positive one I think of as a straw man, but that's essentially the conventional wisdom that rules today, which, as President Clinton said in the State of the Union speech this year, the U.S. faces no direct threats to our national security. And in this scenario, that's the fact today, and it continues to be the case in the future. The second scenario I would call the emergence of major asymmetric threats. In this scenario, adversaries and potential adversaries of the U.S. come to threaten the United States in asymmetric ways. That, I believe, is inevitable. But in my more pessimistic scenario that I want to sketch for you here just briefly, I marry the emergence of asymmetric threats to the likelihood of theft or purchase of one or dozens or scores of nuclear weapons from the arsenal of the former Soviet Union that's contained in Russia today. Now, if you needed a dramatic header for this, I would call it the new dark ages. And in this scenario, imagine that Saddam or Hamas or Hezbollah got control of a dozen or a score of nuclear weapons, and now replay for me Desert Storm. Or that Saddam got control of a dozen nuclear weapons or weapons equivalents, and play for me the current recent confrontation with Iraq. What might be the consequences for people in the area? What might be the consequences for people here? Indeed, go through the conversations about how the U.S. would punish Saddam and Iraq if he fails to comply, and ask why it is that we are off limits. Why are we inherently secure? Indeed, if you want to make this story even worse, imagine that this is not Saddam, because at least we know where he lives, which country he lives, but is some unknown terrorist group, or a group that has plausible deniability between themselves and any known address or government. In that case, if you were stretching your imagination just a little further, imagine that the U.S. felt threatened for Boston or New York or Washington by such a group, or perhaps even that there were 3 or 4 weapons located in 3 or 4 American cities. To what extent would American foreign policy now be less, to conclude, even further? Imagine that the world came to be that weapons of mass destruction came to be relatively accessible to not only states and to rogue states and to poor states, but to other independent actors, to criminal groups, to terrorist groups. In a world in which many groups would have the capacity to destroy virtually anything of value, we might actually see a security environment that would make the pages of Foreign Affairs come alive 25 years from now, as they have done over the past 75 years. So these are 2 scenarios for the future.
Thank you. Sam.
Thank you, Joe. The organizers of this forum have asked each of us to address the future of the world in 5 minutes. That's relatively easy to do. I can do it in 5 seconds. The world ahead is going to be confused, conflictual, confounding, contentious, and contradictory. There it is. It also, as Graham said, is going to be filled with lots of surprises, many of them unpleasant. Let me just try to highlight three possible developments and problems or trends which I think may exist in this world. First, it seems to me quite clearly new patterns of alignment and antagonism are developing and will continue to develop among states. These will supplement and in some cases replace those inherited from the Cold War. Alliances that were formed during the Cold War are weakening. I think we are moving towards a world in which most states, particularly the major powers, will feel relatively solitary. They won't have a lot of close friends among other states. They will be able to carry on cooperative relations with some, and will have antagonistic relations with others, and mixed cooperative and antagonistic relations with a lot of other states. But having very close alliance relationships of the sort that developed during the Cold War, it seems to me it will be relatively rare, with perhaps one or two exceptions. Second, while the United States can be referred to as the only superpower, it is not entirely clear what that means. Clearly, however, little of note in world affairs can be done without the United States, and yet, on the other hand, virtually nothing worthwhile can be done by the United States alone. And in this world, it seems to me we're moving into a situation which is, in some sense, a multipolar world in which the big issues will have to be dealt with by the cooperation ad hoc basis, at least, by the major powers. And undoubtedly, over time, the power relationships among these major states will change. It is interesting, I think, to get back to a point which Jim Hogue made about the emergence of new powers and their incorporation into the international system. 2 weeks ago, the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies held a conference here in which virtually all the major countries and regions of the world were represented. And the purpose of the conference was to discuss the perspectives of the elites of these major countries and regions towards the international system, the trends in the international system, and threats to international stability. I was struck by the extent to which you could group these regions and countries into three broad categories. There were those which were quite happy with the status quo, at least as reported by the scholars and experts from those countries. Those were, of course, the United States. Everything is just perfect as far as we are concerned. Japan, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. There were those regions or countries which were reported to be unhappy, discontented, resentful about the state of the world. These included Russia, India, Arab countries, Muslim countries more generally, and Africa. Then there were those who were reported in effect to be uncertain as to whether what was going on in the world was good for them or not, and very uncertain about their future. And these included China, and I think the whole question as to the relationship of China to the international order and its incorporation into the international order is clearly a very uncertain question, and it's uncertain in the minds of the Chinese as to just how that's going to happen, whether it should happen, on what terms it should happen. And the other was Europe. where the future is uncertain, because clearly, as with the case of China, major changes are taking place. The European Union is presumably moving into a new phase, and it is uncertain what that will mean for Europe, for Europe's relations with the other parts of the world, and particularly Europe's relations with the United States. And it seems to me we may be in for some significant surprises there. Thirdly, this relates, I think, to the whole question of what can be the role of the United States in in the coming years. What is likely to be the role of the United States? As I pointed out in an article in Jim's 75th anniversary issue, it seems to me we are searching for a role and a purpose. During the Cold War, the great problem for the United States was to develop the power necessary to achieve our purposes. We are now in the situation of trying to find purposes for our power. There aren't a lot out there which you can find any real support for among the American public. The people will, of course, endorse the promotion of democracy, market economies, this, that, and the other thing, but who's willing to spend blood and treasure on behalf of these very vague and nebulous causes? And this creates great problems for the foreign policy elite, like those of us at this table, because we all want to have a national purpose that we can think about and promote and mobilize the public to go out to support. But we can't come up with any such purposes, and as a result, the public is, I think, taking a very reasonable attitude. There's no great need at this point in time for us to get terribly activated about what's going on in the world. Almost nobody in the American public, 1 or 2% of the American public, think that foreign affairs is an important issue now. And that, it seems to me, is, at least for the time being, relatively sensible. And so I think the big issue in the future, at any rate, will be whether or not the United States can find another major goal like containing communism, and in the event that we can't, whether we can adapt ourselves to playing a relatively modest role in world affairs.
Thank you, Sam. Jessica.
There is a story about George Bernard Shaw, who was once introducing an after-dinner speaker whom he apparently didn't think too much of, told him that he had 15 minutes, and the gentleman said, 15 minutes? How am I going to tell them what I know in 15 minutes? And Shaw said, I'd advise you to speak very slowly. I can speak very fast, but I can't do the future of the world in 5 minutes. So the best I can do is to tell you about one thin but I think very important slice of what I think the future is going to look like. And to do that, I'd like to ask you to imagine the following scenario. First, an initiative to create a new major international regime is launched over the opposition of the 5 major powers: the United States, Russia, China, Britain, and France. Second, it's launched under no institutional authority at all. Just a group of self-appointed entities issue a kind of a y'all come invitation. Third, no effort in the negotiation is made to reach universal consensus, the usual lowest common denominator. Instead, the states that oppose the initiative are uninvited to the negotiations. This is explicitly a coalition of the willing, and one in which the participants rely on the force of public opinion to drag in the unwilling. Fourth, the participants set a negotiating deadline of 14 months, knowing that comparable undertakings usually take upwards of a decade. Fifth, in this case, states and non-state entities are negotiating on an equal footing, including tabling treaty text. And finally, some of the key strategizing and decision-making is done not in any major capital, but out of a house in Vermont. I would guess that most of you probably know that what I've described here is not the future, but the recent negotiation of an international treaty to ban landmines, anti-personnel landmines. And I think it is terribly important to look at it, not to get involved in the debate about landmines, but as an example of a process that is, I think, one of the first full-blown examples of a very important aspect of what the world ahead will look like. And I'd just like to illustrate some of what I think are the implications of it. First, we are very used in this country to saying that nothing important can happen in the world without U.S. leadership. Obviously, in this case, something quite important has happened with the U.S. in active opposition. Secondly, I think it illustrates what is going to be a very common feature of the empowerment of middle-sized countries through a coalition with international civil society. And here I mean countries like Canada, which is now the second time Canada has done this, the first time being the launching of the International Climate Treaty. The Nordics, in particular, Netherlands, Austria, a lot of the mid-sized European countries, I think are going to see playing a much larger role on the global stage than they have before. Third, the power of public opinion here, enormously important. Since this effort began just a little over a year ago, 3 of those 5 countries, Britain, France, and Russia, have switched their positions. My own view is that the only issue on the 2 that are left is who is going to be last. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if it is, in fact, the U.S. I would guess that China, which still wants to hold an Olympics, will end up signing this treaty. Fourth, the power of email. You cannot overestimate the power of this medium as an international organizing tool. If you ask Jody Williams, who did a lot of, but not all, she should not alone have gotten the Nobel Prize, but that's a different issue, but did a lot of the key organizing in this. How she did it, she gives a one-word answer, email. She basically spent 10 hours a day sending and receiving email. And lastly, well, fifth, I guess, there is inherent in this a major threat to established international organizations. The major power, the states were going to had already spent some years in the United Nations Conference on Disarmament negotiating what everybody knew to be an absolutely futile effort to regulate anti-personnel landmines. And we're planning on spending another 15 years in that forum doing so. Why would any states now, for the next arms control negotiation or entities that really want a result, want to go back to that forum when they've seen what can happen outside it? And a very closely related implication, of course, is speed. NGOs do not have the budgets that allow them to contemplate 10-year or 15-year negotiations. Neither does the private sector. They may have the money, but they don't have the culture or the planning horizon that interests them in a 10 or 15-year negotiation. It's important also to emphasize what it doesn't mean. This appearance, enormously increased power of non-state actors in international negotiations and international arrangements does not mean the disappearance of nation states, and it doesn't mean that power in its hard sense no longer matters. As long, I think, as the United States holds the overwhelming sway of power, and there is not on the near horizon the prospect of major conflict, but interstate conflict, however, I think that the issues that this sector of activity can deal with is going to take a larger and larger role in international affairs. And what I think we will be seeing is the emergence really of 2 systems existing side by side. One, the traditional Westphalian state system that will make the rules by which the other players act, but which will be acting under an increasingly constrained set of circumstances in which free choice is increasingly not free choice for the states. And then there will be this new system whose shape and content we can only begin to guess at, with, I think, new entities different from any we have on the scene now. playing a brand new role. So there's one very quick 5-minute glimpse of the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessica. Nick?
Well, I'm by profession and temperament a historian, and I feel queasy about looking too far ahead into the future. I recall something that a Viennese playwright, Gustav Freytag, said about a century ago. He used to write sort of fluffy plays about Viennese life, not very serious ones. And a colleague asked him once, why don't you do something for the future? And he said, the future? What has the future done for me? And the future will take care of itself. I think we're going to face enormous problems. I don't want to enumerate them. I just casually say that I believe that among the most serious ones we'll encounter will be mass population movements, illegal immigration, the kind of thing that you see in the animal world, the encroachments on territory, which will lead to very, I think, greater violence. But that is not really what I wish to talk about. I have spent my life working on Russian history, and willy-nilly I got involved in Soviet politics, and I ended up in the White House. And I'm struck by the dismal failure of Sovietology, both academic and governmental, in predicting what will happen. The prevailing mood among Sovietologists at the universities, in public life, and in government, particularly institutions like the State Department and the CIA, was that the Soviet Union was a very stable government, not free by our standards, but possessing a certain amount of social equality, which we lack, and that it was a country that we have to get along with, that the harsher we are to it, the harsher they respond, and that we must get along with them, even sometimes sacrificing things which we hold dear. Now that turned out to be totally wrong. In fact, it was a very sick society, and it was a society that responded to kindness with roughness, and to roughness with kindness. When President Reagan took the verbal offensive against communism, we were told that we are inching towards World War III. No less an authority than George Kennan, I remember once giving us a lecture on that subject. And yet it didn't happen. Instead of World War III, we got Gorbachev, perestroika and collapse. Now, the thing that's puzzled me is why? Why were we so wrong? I mean, Sovietology was very lavishly subsidized with hundreds of millions of dollars. Thousands of people were involved in this. We had tremendous access to secret information from the Soviet Union. Why were we wrong, and why has there been no, what the Russians call samokritika, self-criticism? Why doesn't discipline ask itself, what went wrong? We are scientists, and yet we were absolutely wrong. In fact, what is particularly strange about this is that, from my experience, the less educated person was, the better he understood the Soviet Union. You talk to taxi drivers, you talk to workers, they understood very well. And as you went up to PhDs and tenured professors, they understood less and less. And there's something extremely puzzling. And I've tried to solve this problem for myself, and I will share with you some of my ideas, because not just to cast light on the past, but also on the future, because we will very likely encounter similar problems in the future. It may very well be, as at least one speaker mentioned, that China will be our great rival, our great adversary in the next century. And we'll have to avoid making the kind of mistakes we made with the Soviet Union. Well, I've come to the conclusion that probably the main reason for the failure of Sovietology to understand the mentality of the Soviet leaders and the Soviet population was that they thought of themselves as scientists rather as members of the humanities. Politics, to my mind, is a branch of the humanities. You're dealing with human beings. You're not dealing with models. You're dealing not with abstractions. You're dealing with human beings. And that means that you have to know the history, you have to know the literature, you have to know the language, you have to mix with them. When we had hundreds of thousands of refugees come from the Soviet Union, mostly Jewish refugees, our academic community ignored them because we felt that they were embittered, they could not give us the truth. And they were, in fact, were telling us the truth. The same people going to, I remember going to Russia with some Sovietologists, and they would walk on the streets and be very impressed by what they saw. And I said, let's go into the courtyards and look what the courtyards look like. And of course, they were dirty and smelly. that they missed for some reason. They didn't talk to people in Russia or in the various borderlands of Russia. And basically what they did was mirror image on almost all subjects which they encountered. That is, they asked themselves, what would we do if we were in the situation of the Russians? But of course we have a different culture, a different past. Russians lost, as I wrote once in one of my articles, Russians lost more human lives in the defense of Leningrad than we did in all our wars. So their attitude towards lives is very different from ours. And there are many other things one could bring out, and I'll be glad to bring out during the discussion if you wish. So what I wish to say is this, that I think that in the future we shall meet with problems arising from different cultures, different civilizations, different historical backgrounds. And it is very important that we not commit the same mistakes which were committed by Sovietology and dealing with them. And that means that we must have a lot of humility, a lot of knowledge of the history, a lot of knowledge of the literature and the language of these societies, mix with them, study them at first hand, and above all, avoid putting ourselves in their shoes. Try to think the way they do, as they act, not as we would in their place. I think that is a cautionary tale for a future that is undoubtedly going to be murky and that is going to confront us with many problems which require a fundamental change in attitudes towards foreign societies. Thank you.
We now have time for questions and answers. There are 2 microphones on this side and that side, and we have a wide range of subjects that have come up. So who would like to ask a first question? Yes.
Good evening. My name is Guillermo Baracon from Uruguay. I would like to ask Professor Huntington and Professor Matthews 2 questions. I had the chance to read your book, Professor Huntington, and you briefly mentioned those regions are pleased, or at least comfortable with the new economic models. The world is talking one same language today. You mentioned Latin America. I do believe working hard in Latin America, my region, is that it's not very easy to accept the principles of neoliberalism. I mean, to do economic reforms is pretty easy, but to use them, to accept the principles behind the cultural dimension is not very easy. And I would like to ask Professor Matthews, what kind of society, what kind of leadership, which are the responsibilities of the new leadership leading the new societies, not in the Westphalian models in 1648, but the other model you mentioned, civil society, private sector. What are the responsibilities of all these sectors? We have been working so hard, which is a little bit interrelated with the question with Professor Huntington. In Latin America, you don't have a dynamic private sector. You may have one, but it's not responsible. All the principles behind are not there. Thank you very much.
Sam?
Well, I don't know that I was thinking, or that the Latin Americans at this conference were thinking primarily about neoliberalism. I think their relative satisfaction with the state of the world reflected the fact that in the past decade or 2, Latin America has moved by and large towards democratic government, that economic development has taken place, that the processes of economic integration, perhaps most notably with Mcarthur, are occurring, and that by and large Latin America has come to a much more comfortable relationship with the United States. In the past, it seems to me, Latin Americans were either complaining about American imperialism or about America ignoring them. And that problem has sort of been resolved, it seems to me, and their attitude towards the United States reflects it.
Jessica?
Well, I think your question, at least for me, raises the thing that worries me the most about the world that I pictured, because the key difference, of course, is that the major non-state international actors, non-governmental organizations, private sector, even international institutions, are in effect, special interests. They may not be motivated by profit, but they are special interests. And generally, the best of them, the most passionate, the most informed, the most vigorous, are the ones with the most intense tunnel vision, the strongest focus on their own issues. And what you get in a society, I think, where you have a piling up of special interests, rather than one strong entity that is trying to at least represent a common interest. I mean, states often don't, but they at least are supposed to, and they frequently try. You get a very different outcome with this piling up of special interests. And I think one where the outcome is not pretty. And in fact, I think we have seen it increasingly in the US, and much less either effort to articulate what the common interest is or to move towards it. And that is the aspect of the future that I drew for you that worries me the most.
Yes.
Every one of the speakers has spoken really about statism. I haven't heard anything spoken about the theoretical or ideological underpinnings of what the future will be like. And I'd be curious to hear some of the comments from anyone as to what they see in the future on ideological type movements.
Who would like to start out on that? Dick, you watched the rise and fall of communism and warned against failing to see it. Do you have a thought on this?
I think you can observe the future only day by day. That is, you have to have your ear attuned to what's happening. When I was in the White House, this was the years 81, 82, we conducted a very harsh policy towards the Soviet Union because we thought the system itself was driving the country towards aggression. President Reagan was really the first American president who did not just want to punish the Soviet Union for its aggression, but who wanted to eliminate communism because he saw in it a source of aggression. And yet the moment you began to see changes there, which was in 85, 86, 87, he extended a hand of friendship, and it turned out to be the right thing to do. And I think pragmatically, you have to do it that way. We don't know. Some 20 years ago, my friend, the Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski, said to me, I predict a tremendous revival of religion in the world. And I scoffed at it. I thought it was absurd. And yet he was right. We see now religion arising everywhere as a political factor, in this country, in Islam, in Israel, and elsewhere. He came to this conclusion by simply observing the situation as it unfolded. And I am very skeptical of any grandiose schemes of the future. We have a dismal record of predicting the future. Not only I mean we, but almost all observers of the future. Therefore, I like to observe things from day to day as they unfold and perceive the signals which they give and act on that basis. Ideology, to answer your other question, right now ideology, secular ideology seems out and religious ideology seems to take over, but in 20, 25 years it may change.
Jim?
Just two observations, neither of which I think add up to really a full ideology. We may be in for some time in the non-ideological age. But I think, as some commentators have warned, we may be headed into a century in which democracy is going to be under considerable stress in a number of places. It has extended from its historic base to good parts of the world, and there it is rather fragile. And given the kinds of problems that are arising, water shortages, population increases, environmental degradation, fights over resources, I think there is a good chance that we could see quite an assertion of authoritarianism of various kinds in various parts of the world. I'm not sure, however, they will be fueled so much by an all-encompassing ideology as they will be by the problems they have to deal with. Second observation I would make is that in the developed world and in parts of the developing world, like Latin America, we have seen a real diminution of leftist ideology and leftist political organizations. Whether within the democratic construct or whether straddling it, I would foresee at some point a revival of thinking on the left that would be more systemic than what we see today, as a way of organizing an awful lot of those that are going to feel left out of the political processes as they find them. On the last point, I would just say, we were discussing before this meeting the return of religion, so to speak, and I would subscribe to what Richard Pipes has just said, and I know that Sam Huntington has been doing some studies on this subject, and at least on this question or another one you might want to pop up.
Do you want to speak to this one, or should we go to?
Well, Dick and Jim have made the 2 points I was going to make. One is that religion is clearly the ideology of the present in most of the world, in replacing the old political ideologies. And secondly, it seems to me it is very likely, since history does in some sense go through a dialectical process, that after the triumph of liberal capitalism and market economies, there is going to be a swing back towards some form of leftism, and I think we can already see the beginnings of that occurring.
John,
Yes.
let me
Grant.
just do one line to disagree. I think that I don't disagree with the proposition that religion is becoming a more powerful force, but I think that if we stand back, at least to me, it seems the most resilient and along the most resilient of the isms, and the one that looks to me the most powerful for the past quarter century and likely in the future, is basically consumerism, which is what people want more and impose as demands on their governments, the demand that there's real increases in their standard of living. And I think that seems to me of all the forces the most pervasive, but I think we're sort of taking it for granted as the base.
The most depressing thing about this discussion was this comment by Graham, which has now elevated consumerism into an ideology.
I call it free market capitalism.
I thought it was a religion in America.
How about nationalism? I'm surprised nobody's mentioned that. Well, I will briefly. I think it's already upon us, and I think it is. I think if we would look at an ism that has probably been the strongest throughout the 20th century, it is nationalism in one form or another, and it seems to be very, very vigorous again. And while it can be a constructive force, it is too often, and I think we can see it in some places, it is too often a very destructive force. I would expect we're going to have to deal with various nationalisms and the problems that they bring for quite some time to come in the next century.
Yes.
Hi, my name's John Mcarthur. I'm a student at the Kennedy School, and I have a question for Dr. Matthews and anyone else who might want to add to it. And it goes to your points about the lessons that we might have learned from the landmines negotiation process. And given the role that particularly the Canadian Foreign Minister played in that, and the very symbiotic relationship between the more civil society movement and the necessity of the state players to use that middle power role and a convening power, I found it very interesting, your comments about why would they want to go back to the traditional fora if this sort of avant-garde sense of negotiation might be the harbinger of things to come. And Foreign Minister Axworthy just this week suggested that perhaps the APEC conference could be used as an area for branching out for traditional economic concerns and and he suggested that it should be something for more human rights dialogue and other types of initiatives along the lines of this landmine. I'm wondering what you think of this as a feasible proposal, and how much you think that this might be something that isn't necessarily moving towards a new type, but actually using the fora that are existent already for different types of initiatives.
I think that could well happen. What I was trying to highlight was a kind of a purer case that's really quite different, where, I mean, everything that you have in the UN system is an organization created of, by, and for states. And if you followed the landmine conference, even more than the climate business that preceded it, what was so striking was that, first of all, the initiative came, of course, Senator Leahy is really the guy who should have gotten, I think, a good deal more of the credit for what's happened. But so it's not a sort of governments versus NGOs. But the initiative here came entirely from a very small NGO coalition, and then the oomph behind it and the push behind it also came out of what became a huge international coalition. Axworthy played a key role, and so did some other individuals. But you had here, when the negotiations began, just as for example, there were 3 complete treaty texts tabled, 2 by governments and 1 by the NGO coalition. I mean, anybody who's ever been a diplomat working for a government, this is just, you know, it doesn't figure. That and the concept that you would create a coalition of the willing and forget the states that didn't want to play, even if in this case they were all 5 of the major powers, is also something that doesn't compute by any of the usual rules. So, whereas I think you will have, and indeed I think one of the major features of the world will be these hybrid institutions, like maybe adding NGOs to OPEC and stuff, where groups are, I mean, states and non-states and the private sector are all mushed up together. And there are lots and lots of examples. It's the most flourishing change on the international scene. Still, I just think it's important to see what is really quite new and different in this example.
Yes.
Mikhail Zildovich from Harvard Law School. My question concerns the sort of the aspect of American power that I guess hasn't really been mentioned, the military side of it. The ongoing revolution in military affairs is basically ensures that this country will be prepared for World War IV by the time the first decade of next century is over. And this is sort of a general question to whoever wants to respond. Do you believe that there is still a necessity to spend the money, very considerable amounts of money, to develop what could be a very important trump card in this new world to come, or whether or not this is just a sort of a development of more power without purpose that Mr. Huntington mentioned?
Graham, you're a defense official, and what is the answer?
I would say two things. I think first that the revolution of military affairs that you refer to is a ongoing phenomena. This is basically the application of information technologies plus to the forms of warfare, and that this set of developments is actually increasing the relative advantage of U.S. military forces as against alternative forces, and therefore increasing the dominance of the U.S. on traditional battlefields. And I think both of those are good things. That's point one. But point two, I think that the point that I tried to make before, that therefore any strategist thinking about this problem from the point of view of Saddam or Hamas or Hezbollah or Libya will immediately consider after Desert Storm that they're not going to rerun that again. I mean, this is a pretty clear story. You run against dominance, you get beat very badly. And as a consequence, we'll think strategically about asymmetric responses. The asymmetric responses might, I think, include, for example, thinking about the American homeland and thinking about terrorist acts and even thinking about extreme terrorist acts and many other possibilities. And I think if we take our $250 billion defense budget, which is approximately the level of the U.S. defense budget, and say, how much are we devoting to programs and to threats that came to be familiar during the Cold War, on the one hand, and how much to asymmetric and new threats that seem to me to loom larger and more prominently, that currently these things are not in balance, and therefore that the money is not being wisely invested across the threat spectrum. Or to think about it just one other angle, if you think about threats in terms of a Category 1 threat, a Category 2 threat, a Category 3 threat, in defense planning, you have two major regional contingencies for which most of the budget is justified. It would seem to me that there's another contingency at least as large as those two, which would be an unconventional contingency. Hard to take account of in advance, but needing to be taken account of. And I think the revolution in military affairs is not helping that particularly. In fact, it may be harming it.
Since I wrote an article in, of all places, Foreign Affairs on this subject, I'll add a note. I agree with what Graham said, but it is also important to remember that the application of information technology to military capability deals with the first of the issues that Jim Hogue mentioned, which is the rise of new powers. There are a lot of people in the United States now who are very afraid that China is going to be a power that will challenge us or surpass us in the next century. And I think if one looks carefully at the revolutionary military affairs and the relative capabilities of China and the U.S., China is not going to be that great a threat. There's an Australian defense analyst named Paul Dibb who did a paper recently at the International Institute of Strategic Studies looking at East Asia and asking what will the application of information technology to military capabilities do in terms of relative power in the region into the first 10 to 20 years of the next century. And the interesting conclusion is it will increase the American lead, not decrease it. So I think that while Graham is right in terms of the incentives for terrorism or asymmetrical responses, it's also worth noticing that there is another question, which is the rise of new powers and whether the Americans have to be fearful as they approach the rise of a new power. And the answer is the Americans don't need to be fearful. There's no need for a major conflict in China unless we get it into our heads that it's necessary.
Joe, can
yeah,
just,
Jessica.
I mean, I think the question also addressed, do we need to spend so much money? My answer is yes, because I think it is American power that creates the global security framework in which the other trends that we've talked about play out. And if there were to reappear the possibility of major interstate conflict, then all bets are off about everything that we've said tonight that we can extrapolate from the present.
Yes.
Dean Nye, distinguished members of the panel. My name is Peter McEwen. I'm a Kennedy School MPA student. And I'm wondering if the panel could address the dichotomy that sometimes occurs between the economic interests and our long-term strategic, social, and political goals. And I'm thinking particularly, of course, the growth of the large multinational corporations, and perhaps dealing with China, where perhaps it could be argued that some of the changes occurred because, and some of our approaches are because of economic interests rather than perhaps long-term strategic or political interests.
Jim, do you want to try that one?
Well, to start with where you left off, I'm not, at the moment, I don't see that there is a great contradiction between general business aims as far as China is concerned and American policy. Now, if we go to a tactical level, yes, indeed, there are times in which a business community, which is thinking, as it should, primarily about business and has less expertise or interest in issues of security or sometimes of human rights, and will lobby vociferously for a particular part of a policy that affects them, and we run the risk of them having an inordinate influence. But I really don't see that as the case at the moment. As long as there's a fairly transparent system of who's lobbying for what, the fact that we have a large private sector and a large civil society that have interests in the American relationship with China is to me more of a plus than it is a minus. And to the extent that the business community was a player in selling the idea that whether China is to be a major threat or not, it is still going to be a great power, to the extent that they helped shape our sense that we have to have a broad spectrum policy between the United States and China, rather than one that rests or is hinged on one or two particular issues in a particular area, specifically human rights. I think that has been for the good. Because I do think it is true that if you go across the range of things where we are interacting and are going to interact that are of great consequence to us, it is good that we are looking at a number of things, not a specific one. And as long as we are aware of what our business community's interests are and the efforts they go to, then when they are out of line, I think they can be counteracted. So far, I haven't seen that there's a significant danger or difference.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Thad McBride, first-year law student. Just want to thank the panel for coming out on this cold night. It's a lot better than doing homework. My question is basically about a concern I have about this growing isolationism worldwide, but especially within the United States. Speaks specifically to Professor Huntington's third point he made in his opening remarks. My question basically is, do you think that because we sort of lack this large enemy that we can demonize and that the American public can rally around, do you think that's a large part of the general apathy about international relations, foreign affairs in general, or do you think that that's merely a coincidence? And if so, what do you think will reverse this trend?
Sam, you want to try that?
Well, I think that's clearly is a large part of it, as I said, and we haven't been actively engaged in the world for most of our history, and the Cold War was the great exception during peacetime. And now it seems to me, in a sense, we're going back to normal. And foreign policy is becoming increasingly focused upon much narrower issues, particularistic issues, often commercial interests on the one hand, commercial issues, and often responses to the pressures from ethnic groups on the other hand. And it seems to me that's not isolationism. We obviously are actively involved in the world, but we're not involved in the world with a grand overall purpose and set of goals. And it seems to me that is likely to last for a long time. I wouldn't interpret the figures I cited as with respect to people, the public, not thinking that foreign policy isn't a major issue as an indication of isolationism, because I think everybody recognizes that we're involved in the world, and particularly on the economic front, where our situation has changed drastically during the past 2 or 3 decades. So we are heavily dependent upon economic involvement in the world, but that is not going to generate any sort of overall strategic purpose or vision.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Kevin Boyle, also of the law school, and my question is for Mr. Pipes. Related to your discussion about the cultural and historical factors of Russia and how we mispredicted or did not predict correctly, do you see any links to China's cultural or historical background that would affect their trajectory? And B, given the 20th century relationship between Russia and China, how Russia might react to the economic and military dynamism of their neighbor?
Well, I know very little about China. I've been there twice, but I was struck. I was there during the communist period, and 78 and 84, and I was struck how fundamentally different China was from the Soviet Union. Obviously, there were powerful cultural factors there that affected the doctrine and the system of government which they have. And I cannot speak with any authority on Chinese culture and what needs to be understood about it, but very clearly there are factors there which are present. I was always struck by something that Bernard Lewis told me about the Arab mentality. He was a great historian of the Middle East. And he gave me a parable. A father has 2 sons, and he tells him to do something. And the first son says, I will do it, and does not do it. And the second son says, I will not do it, and does it. Which is the better son? It turns out in the Arabic culture, the first son is the better because he did not insult his father, even though he didn't do what he wanted. But it's a highly verbal culture. Words mean a great deal to Arabs. And, there are things in China, obviously, which people who be dealing with that subject have to immerse themselves in order to understand. Question about Russia and China. Russians have a very instinctive dislike of the Chinese. They think them cunning and sly and hostile, basically. There are all kinds of jokes about the Chinese, which are all of the same kind. They work so hard, they're fanatical, not reliable. And the Chinese reciprocate. I was in China in '78 as a guest of the government, and I was being taken to the airport after whatever I was there, 2 or 3 weeks. And my guide from the Academy of Sciences said to me as he said goodbye to me, says, "Remember, Mr. Pipes, Russians always lie." So, looked at it from this point of view, I don't think there is a chance of a great deal of amity, because it's very important for Russians to regard themselves and be regarded as Westerners and not as Orientals. They have a tremendous fear of being regarded as Orientals. So I don't think they will draw very close. So for tactical reasons, they might, particularly now as a result of the expansion of NATO.
Yes.
John Aquatella from the Fletcher School. This is for Mr. Jim Hogue. You mentioned the issue of free trade, and the rise of free trade in goods has come hand in hand with the nearly complete deregulation of financial flows. And many people are arguing that this has become a new source of external instability for the developing world. Witness the Mexican crisis in the early 90s and the recent Asian crisis, even in Korea, where the fundamental seems to be right. And basically the question is, do you think that for the sake of saving free trade, something will have to be done on the financial markets? I mean, maybe throw sand in their gears, like Keynes said some decades ago.
Well, if I heard you correctly, you said the deregulation of financial. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I see it differently. I think the problem, for example, in Asia, points up to the absence of effective regulation of financial markets and of financial institutions like banks, like trading, like stock markets, like financial reporting. There is just simply not enough transparency in the financial dealings in large parts of the world. So I, if anything, would say that while there's plenty of room for deregulation in an old-fashioned sense, tariffs, customs regulations, import rules, and the rest of it, in this area of financial, of capital flows and investment and so on, and financial transactions within areas, there's a need for structural changes that involve more regulation along the Western model. As for Mexico, I don't think that what happened to Mexico is because of loose financial practices or a flooding in of foreign capital. I think it occurred essentially because of mismanagement of the domestic economy and domestic institutions by the Mexican government. And again, precisely because there was no transparency, it was almost impossible for checks and balances to come into play in time.
We can do two more questions, here and there.
Hi, I'm David Graff, a mid-career student at the Kennedy School, and I'd like to address this to Professor Allison. If I understand correctly, you've played some role as an advisor to the Russian government and possibly some other former Soviet republics on the disposition of their nuclear weapons, safety, accident, and things of this nature. Your second scenario tonight indicated possibly that things weren't going so well, that you were potentially worried about theft and terrorism. I wonder if you could give us any kind of update on the status of nuclear weapons in the Soviet Union and whether we have anything in the short term to be concerned about.
I thought the question is, why were you such a poor advisor?
Right. Well, there's the good news and the bad news. The good news is that all the nuclear weapons have been taken out of all the republics other than Russia, so they're all back in Russia. And the bad news is that the weapons and weapons usable material that's back in Russia is at risk of being stolen or sold. Now, the complexities is a long subject, but the main fact, I think, is that the remarkable transformation of the Russian society that's an ongoing, almost revolutionary process, has been tearing down totalitarian structures that were, as President Reagan used to say, an evil empire. It was like a prison for the whole society. These forces of freedom have basically torn down the walls of these prisons, destroying virtually all of the central control systems of the old Soviet Union. But the bad news side of that is that these include the control systems and the custodians that are in charge of nuclear weapons or weapons usable nuclear material in a society that's chaotic and often criminalized. So I think that it's a remarkable fact that things haven't turned out worse yet, but it remains I mean, if you said, what's the most different thing from 75 years ago when foreign affairs got started? I would say the most different thing is that there's about 100,000 nuclear weapons equivalents in a state that's in the midst of some degree of chaos and criminalization.
Yes, this will be the last question.
I'm Zach, a student. We know that world trade is going to make, the global trade is going to play a crucial role in the world to come. And in this context, wanted to know what your opinion was on the way the trade agreements are conducted. We know that now we have more or less a carrot and stick policy where developing world more or less is forced to take certain standards or adopt standards dictated by the developed world. And sometimes this could lead to unstable political situations, rock states, and so on. So instead of developing or channeling all the money into try to contain these rogue states, try to channelize the money in giving up some of those options in the trade agreement so that these economies can build themselves up a little better, and you can have less discounted and rogue states to deal with.
Jim, I guess you raised trade in your remarks. We'll let you have the last word.
I think a number of things are going to have to be done in the area of trade if indeed we're to have a continued liberalizing global order. One, and this refers to the last question as well, is there is obviously a crying need for structural changes that go along with liberalization, such as the development of Social Security and pension systems that are modern and fairly pervasive, such as banking regulations, and so forth. As I look at the future, I'm a bit pessimistic from what I see. I think we're headed into a period in which growth rates in the developing world are going to slow down considerably, that what's happened in Southeast Asia is not going to be as much of an exception as we think. I think that the developed world, given the technological advantage it has, which I think is going to grow, is going to be in even better shape and trade more within itself in the next generation than has been the case in the latter. In the developing world, whether we attribute it to trade or to industrialization or modernization, which is even a bigger term, and I would favor the latter, it's not just a trade issue, we have to expect that there's going to be very large scale, I think, social disruptions. I think the past is prologue, that when you put societies through things as major as transformation to an industrial urban-based society, that incumbent with it during the period of transition that can be quite long is an extraordinary amount of social disruption. Dick Pipes mentioned migratory populations are going to be a problem in the future. They already are. And we have figures in China which are staggering. And at some point, let me give you a Allison type scenario. If we have 80 to 100 million people on the move looking for jobs in urban areas in China, and that's the figure you can get, and you have an economy that has been growing at approximately a 10% rate for some 25 years, suddenly declining to about 5%, which is where it is right now, and there's a considerable slowdown. What kind of a scenario do you have? You have an awful lot of people looking for jobs far from home in a situation of kind of urban mass and a deteriorating economic situation. So maybe I'm straying a bit from your question. I'm trying to get away from the view, which I think is mistaken, that it is trade per se that is causing all of these problems. I think it is a bigger issue than that, involving a lot of aspects of modernization.
Thank you very much. Let me say that before we thank our panel, I'll remind you that after you leave here, you should rush out and get a copy of the American Encounter. And if you can't do that, at least get the current issue of Foreign Affairs.
Joe, could I just say before you, thank you and the Kennedy School for helping us celebrate our 75th anniversary. As I said, we owe a lot to this community over the years, and I'm very appreciative that you would let us come up here and say so.
Well, we're delighted to have you here, and thank the panel. That's good. You got a good wide range of questions.
What's next after landmark?
Thank you very much for answering the question.
You missed a big chance, though, of not putting my information article until I was